We live in a world that's constantly buzzing with the next big strategy, the revolutionary technique. But have you ever considered if the real power for profound spiritual change, especially in our rapidly evolving world, lies in something deeply rooted, something that bridges the ancient and the new?
That's a really interesting question to start with. And the resources you've pulled together, they really dig into that exact intersection, don't they? Focusing specifically on prayer, not just, as some dusty old ritual, but as a vibrant and active force in the work of evangelization.
Absolutely. And you've given us some truly compelling material here, explorations of how to strategically weave prayer into mission efforts, these historical accounts showing its impact, and some really practical ways to apply it.
Right.
So our goal today, I think, is to carefully sift through these insights and pull out the most significant takeaways on how prayer really acts as both the fundamental groundwork and the power source for spreading the gospel. We're looking for those maybe surprising connections and genuinely useful bits of knowledge.
And this feels particularly relevant for you listening in. As someone likely dedicated to your field and, clearly driven by a desire for purposeful innovation, understanding how this principle of prayer might integrate into strategic thinking the sources suggest it could unlock some truly transformative results.
Okay, let's get into it then. The material consistently puts prayer right there at the bottom
Yeah.
as the bedrock of evangelization. It's not painted as an add-on. It's like the essential foundation everything else has to rest on.
Yeah, and what's compelling in these sources is how deep that idea runs, theologically and biblically speaking. I mean, from Genesis right through to Revelation, prayer is this constant thread, isn't it? It's shown as humanity's sort of primary way of connecting with God.
Like Moses at the burning bush.
Exactly, like Moses. His prayer there, it wasn't just asking for something. The sources frame it as the catalyst for that divine revelation, for his specific calling. And then you look at Jesus' own life, characterized by him regularly pulling away to pray. It sets this clear pattern of dependence on the Father, especially, when facing the huge spiritual challenges of his ministry.
Right. And the sources stress this wasn't just like personal quiet time. It was fundamental to how effective his mission was.
Absolutely. More than just piety, it was integral.
That's a powerful point about Jesus. And it's not just these isolated big moments, is it? The material really emphasizes how the early church, in the book of Acts, was just marked by this constant rhythm of prayer.
Mm-hmm.
Their persistent prayer wasn't passive waiting. It directly came before and went alongside the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, which in turn empowered them, right, to spread the gospel, often in really dangerous situations. It suggests a pretty direct link between prayer and impact.
Exactly, a direct link. And if you widen the lens a bit, scripturally, you've got the Epistle of James reminding us that faith without works is, incomplete.
Right. Dead, basically.
Right. But what these sources really underscore is that prayer is what animates that faith. It provides the spiritual energy that turns belief into tangible, effective action in the world. So it's not really a choice between prayer and action. It's more like a dynamic synergy. Prayer fuels and directs the efforts.
It's actually quite striking to see how this seems to have played out historically.
Mm.
The material gives examples, doesn't it? Figures like Augustine, Teresa of Avila, even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and how their really deep, rich prayer lives were the source, the wellspring of their courageous witness. And they had a lasting impact, not just on individuals, but on society, too. It wasn't just about their own private devotion.
What really resonates in those examples, I think, is how their prayer provided this kind of spiritual framework for their public actions. It wasn't just discipline. It was, in a way, the strategic prep work that let them navigate really complex challenges and speak with authority.
That makes sense.
And then if you look at the broader revival movements across history, the sources indicate these weren't just, sudden emotional surges. They were consistently preceded and sustained by deep collective prayer, often involving fasting and really focused intercession.
Right.
It suggests that the spiritual intensity wasn't purely human-generated, but was understood as a kind of response to divine intervention initiated through prayer.
That brings up an important point about mission work today, actually. The sources suggest that across different denominations, different organizations, prayer is still seen as the essential starting point. Mission strategies often kick off with prayer, recognizing that fundamental need for God's guidance and, intervention in what's seen as a basically spiritual task.
So, okay, if those are the foundations, how does this translate into, actual practices? How can people or groups really integrate prayer more effectively into what they're doing evangelistically?
Well, the sources lay out several practical paths. On the personal level, cultivating a consistent, deep prayer life is presented as crucial. This means intentionally setting aside time for reflection, for communion with God,
Right.
actively engaging in intercessory prayer that's praying specifically for others, and also taking part in communal prayer, whether that's small groups or the wider church community.
Yeah.
The sources imply there's real power generated in that collective spiritual focus.
And it goes beyond just personal habits, doesn't it? The material talks about strategically embedding prayer right into the planning and execution of evangelism itself.
Exactly. Things like starting new initiatives with dedicated prayer times, keeping a focus on prayer throughout a mission, even documenting instances where prayer seemed to make a clear difference. These are all highlighted as key. It kind of shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from relying only on human plans, towards being deeply anchored in seeking and, frankly, expecting divine guidance.
And the role of leadership comes up again here, doesn't it? It seems particularly significant.
Very much so. The sources really emphasize how leaders who model a consistent life of prayer, who show they rely on God in decisions, and how they cast vision, they have this profound influence on their teams. It helps make sure the whole mission stays aligned with that higher purpose.
What's interesting there is the idea that prayer, as is presented in these texts, does more than just, ask for stuff. It actually shapes the whole ethos of an organization or a movement.
How so?
Well, it cultivates values like humility, perseverance, and that deep reliance on God, which the sources argue are all essential for effective evangelization, especially when you run into resistance or opposition.
Which inevitably happens.
Which inevitably happens. And that leads us nicely into the transformative impact the sources attribute to prayer. They describe how prayer builds up spiritual resilience, strengthening believers against discouragement, against fear, providing that inner strength when challenges hit.
It feels like it connects our immediate struggles with something bigger, doesn't it? That connection between our sort of daily experience and God's eternal purposes.
Precisely. Prayer reminds us that our efforts aren't just limited to what we can see or measure right now. It connects our human work with this larger divine story, filling our evangelistic efforts with a real sense of hope and ultimate meaning.
And ultimately, the sources seem to suggest that prayer fosters a more, holistic approach to ministry. It's not just about outward actions or getting people to change behaviors.
No.
It's about the inner transformation of the heart. As the Spirit works inside through prayer, believers become these living demonstrations of God's love, grace, and power, which is maybe the most compelling kind of evangelism there is.
That's a powerful thought.
So if we shift our focus just slightly, the material also looks at prayer not just as the foundation, but as the actual driving force behind evangelization, that unseen power that pushes it forward.
Okay, so moving from foundation to engine, essentially, how do the sources describe prayer as this active driving force?
Well, it consistently points back to the Bible, to the narrative. Prayer is shown again and again as that direct line to God. The material reiterates how key figures, Moses, David, Jesus, all turn to prayer before taking on major tasks.
Right. It wasn't an afterthought.
Not at all. Often the essential first step. And again, that early church in Acts just stands out, doesn't it? As a powerful example of a community whose whole mission was sustained through fervent, ongoing prayer.
And the material shares some pretty compelling historical stories, too, in this context. Personal accounts from missionaries who found strength, who witnessed unexpected breakthroughs, specifically through prayer. Even when facing, intense opposition or really difficult circumstances, these aren't just vague ideas.
What kind of breakthroughs are we talking about? What do the sources highlight?
Well, they describe a whole range, actually, from things like physical healings and the softening of really hardened hearts, right through to the transformation of entire communities, often in ways that just seemed humanly impossible. And again, those revivals throughout church history, they're presented not just as the result of great preaching, but as events often kicked off and sustained by collective, passionate prayer. The suggestion is that prayer somehow created a receptive space for spiritual awakening.
And the theological reflection here, as presented in the sources, seems quite important. It talks about the interplay, the connection between the internal practice of prayer and the external act of sharing the gospel.
Yes, they're not separate boxes.
No, they're deeply intertwined. Prayer is what nourishes and empowers the outward proclamation. The idea is, without that inner life of prayer, even the most polished message can lack, spiritual power.
And the material really underscores prayer's power to overcome obstacles, those deep-seated spiritual barriers that resist the gospel message. It suggests it's in those moments of sincere, focused intercession that God's transformative power is kind of unleashed, operating beyond what humans can do to bring about real change.
You mentioned spiritual strongholds earlier.
Yes. When the sources use that term, they often seem to be referring to these deeply ingrained beliefs or cultural forces that actively resist the gospel. Prayer is presented as a key way to start dismantling those.
So if prayer is really this driving force, how can we practically, integrate it into our evangelization strategies day to day?
The sources offer several practical pathways. Cultivating an intentional prayer life is, again, paramount. Establishing daily times for devotion, forming networks, groups of people committed to praying for specific needs,
Right.
and even setting aside time for retreats or longer periods focused on deepening that connection with God. It's really about making prayer a consistent priority, not just when there's a crisis.
And it also means strategically weaving prayer into the actual work of mission itself. The material suggests things like dedicating specific times for group prayer before launching any outreach, encouraging the use of prayer journals to track experiences and perceived answers, and even running workshops to equip people in how to pray effectively for evangelization. It's about being deliberate and giving people the tools.
And again, and it's a recurring theme, leadership plays such a vital role in demonstrating this commitment. Leaders who visibly prioritize prayer, they set the tone, don't they? They cultivate an environment where prayer is genuinely valued and seen as essential, not just a nice-to-have extra.
When we think about this prayer-centered approach, what are the bigger implications, according to the sources?
Well, they highlight several things: how it fosters spiritual renewal and resilience, especially when things feel uncertain, and how shared prayer can actually unite communities, bringing people together around a common purpose that might even transcend their differences.
That's powerful.
And ultimately, the idea is that by grounding our efforts to share the gospel in prayer, we're laying a foundation that can last, passing on not just methods or programs, but that deeper understanding that every truly effective mission is born from and sustained by prayer.
The material also really digs into understanding the spiritual roots of mission, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Tracing that essential link between prayer and evangelization right back to the beginnings of the church.
Yes, it really explores those spiritually charged beginnings, focusing on the early church in Acts. Think about Peter and John, their consistent habit of prayer leading to that miracle at the temple gate. The sources present that not as a one-off, but flowing from a pattern.
And Pentecost itself.
And Pentecost, absolutely. That pivotal moment, the birth of the church, which the text explicitly says followed the disciples' unified and persistent prayer.
What's particularly significant about the unity nature of that prayer?
Well, the sources seem to suggest it wasn't just, individuals praying their own prayers in the same room. It was a shared commitment, a deep alignment of their hearts and minds that appeared to create an environment ready for the Holy Spirit's outpouring. And the material also points again to Jesus' own practice. Before making huge decisions like choosing his apostles, he'd often pull away for extended prayer, seeking that divine guidance and clarity.
And that specific instruction in Matthew 9 to pray for laborers for the harvest field that really underscores a direct connection, right? Prayer isn't just about getting ourselves ready. It's actively participating in advancing the mission by aligning it with God's power and purpose.
Exactly. Then the material gets into the theological underpinnings. It explains prayer as fundamentally about aligning our will with God's will. It's about transforming our maybe human ambitions into a collaborative effort with the divine.
So not just a shopping list of requests.
Not at all. It's presented as entering into a dialogue with the one who holds ultimate authority. This idea of divine alignment suggests a process seeking God's perspective and, crucially, surrendering our own agendas.
And prayer is also described as a vital channel for spiritual empowerment.
Yes, bringing divine strength and resources into the human situation, which helps dismantle those spiritual barriers resisting the gospel. It's that persistent intercession, praying for others, that the sources suggest can soften hearts and prepare them to receive truth.
So, again, how do we translate this understanding into practical mission work?
Well, the sources reiterate many of the same practical points, reinforcing their importance. Cultivating a lifestyle marked by prayer, daily devotion, prayer partnerships for support, intentional retreats for deeper connection.
And strategically.
Strategically, it means initiating mission work with prayer, using things like prayer journals to track God's faithfulness and answered prayer, and equipping more believers through workshops focused on effective prayer. And yes, the vital role of leaders modeling and encouraging this commitment comes up yet again.
It's a consistent thread.
It really is. And the broader implications stemming from this perspective are significant too. The material suggests unified prayer can be a catalyst for wider spiritual awakening, that it bridges the gap between our temporary efforts in God's eternal story, and that it can even foster unity in a world so often marked by division.
The concept of prayer preceding breakthrough is another major theme the sources explore. That idea of intimate communication with God being the often hidden catalyst for really dramatic changes.
Yes, and it looks back to the Old Testament for examples like Moses' powerful intercession for the Israelites after the whole golden calf incident. The sources suggest this wasn't about Moses changing God's mind, fundamentally,
Right.
but about aligning the people's hearts with God's own compassion and justice. And that alignment then paved the way for their restoration.
And that idea of preparation through prayer seems key there.
Yeah.
Moses' prayer wasn't just asking for forgiveness. It was a kind of strategic realignment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Preparing the nation spiritually for what was next.
Exactly. And then in the New Testament, Jesus' own life is held up as the ultimate example, intentionally withdrawing into prayer as a very source of his power and authority. These times of solitude weren't him stepping away from his mission. They were essential for sustaining and empowering it. The sources stress this was a regular pattern.
And the commissioning of the disciples, telling them to wait in Jerusalem, immersed in prayer until they received power from the Holy Spirit. It underlines that prayer wasn't just a preliminary step before the Great Commission. It was the very means by which they were equipped to fulfill it.
And the book of Acts just keeps providing examples, doesn't it? Prayer directly preceding major breakthroughs. Peter and John healing the man at the temple gate. Paul and Silas's miraculous release from prison. These aren't presented as random events, but as outcomes rooted in a consistent practice of prayer.
So what are the practical takeaways from this specific angle? How does this understanding of prayer coming before breakthrough shape what we do?
Well, the sources circle back to cultivating that daily habit of prayer, forming prayer circles for focused intercession, diligently documenting and reflecting on answered prayer, and intentionally integrating prayer into strategic planning, whether in ministry or other parts of life. And yes, once again, the crucial role of leadership in modeling and fostering a prayer-centered culture, it keeps coming back to that.
The material then seems to broaden out, offering a really multifaceted picture of prayer and evangelization. It's not just one thing.
Exactly. It describes prayer first as preparation and discernment, that dedicated space where we can consciously set aside our own agendas and really try to listen for God's specific purposes, gaining the spiritual clarity we need to guide our efforts effectively.
And then there's the aspect of spiritual power and breakthrough. Recognizing that sharing the gospel isn't always easy, that it's often framed as a spiritual battle, where prayer becomes our most potent weapon against forces that oppose it. The sources often bring up Ephesians 6:12 here, highlighting the unseen nature of this struggle.
Right. It's about unleashing divine intervention through that fervent intercession, actively working to dismantle those spiritual barriers that keep hearts closed off. The idea of binding and loosing, often discussed here, theologically refers to aligning ourselves with God's will to resist negative spiritual influences and release his purposes.
And prayer also plays a key role in empowering the witnesses themselves,
Right.
those sharing their faith.
Absolutely. Providing them with the courage and wisdom to speak with conviction and clarity. Being imbued, as the sources suggest, with the power of the Holy Spirit. Consistent prayer fosters this boldness and grace.
And it's also about preparing the ground, cultivating fertile soil in people's hearts.
Yes, softening resistance to the gospel through prayer, inviting those divine encounters that can just profoundly change someone's life. The sources really emphasize that prayer prepares the way for these encounters.
And finally, prayer is what sustains and multiplies the impact. It turns that initial spark into a lasting flame, empowering new believers to become change agents themselves. It's presented as this ongoing cycle, fueled by prayer.
The material also spends quite a bit of time looking at the global prayer movement, highlighting its historical significance and its ongoing impact today.
What are some of the key historical examples that really drive this home?
The sources frequently point to the Moravians back in the 18th century, their incredible commitment to 247 prayer that went on, over 100 years?
Incredible.
And how that directly fueled a remarkable wave of missionary activity worldwide. Another example often mentioned is the student volunteer movement in the 19th century, significantly sparked by a powerful prayer meeting, which led to literally thousands of young people dedicating their lives to mission work. These examples show a tangible link between sustained prayer and missional action.
And more recently.
More recently, the emergence of movements like 24/7 prayer and the International House of Prayer, IHOP, are mentioned. Their dedication to continuous intercession and the reported spiritual renewal and increased openness to the gospel that often seems to accompany these efforts. The sources suggest a correlation there that's hard to ignore.
Interesting.
The material also tries to unpack the underlying principles why these movements might be effective, reiterating prayer's role in preparing hearts, discerning God's will, engaging with spiritual dynamics of opposition and empowerment, and cultivating that receptiveness to the gospel message.
So how can we practically foster a culture of global prayer, maybe in our own smaller spheres?
Well, it starts with integrating prayer intentionally into daily life, personal devotions, joining community prayer gatherings, maybe using prayer journals. It also involves fostering prayer-focused initiatives within churches or organizations, setting up prayer teams, organizing specific prayer meetings for missions, even using tech to connect with global prayer networks.
Right.
And as we've heard repeatedly, leaders who actively model a commitment to prayer are absolutely essential in cultivating this kind of culture.
The global prayer movement, as these sources describe it, really does stand as this powerful testament, doesn't it, to the impact of collective, sustained prayer. From early biblical examples right through the Moravians to modern movements, it's a consistent, significant theme.
Absolutely. And the theoretical discussion really tries to unpack the power behind it, prayer as that strategic alignment with God's purposes, as a tool in spiritual warfare leading to breakthroughs, and as the source of empowerment and preparation for effective mission engagement.
So the practical application then becomes about intentionally weaving prayer into, well, every aspect of our evangelistic efforts, building strategic prayer networks, developing personal plans for intercession, praying specifically before, during, and after outreach, addressing spiritual opposition through prayer, and just making prayer a central, vital part of church life itself.
And finally, the material really tackles the importance of understanding and navigating the spiritual dimensions of evangelization, recognizing it's not just about sharing ideas, but engaging with spiritual realities.
And prayer is presented as totally central to that spiritual engagement, isn't it? It's framed not just as a conversation, but sometimes as interacting with unseen forces, that whole discussion around spiritual warfare.
Exactly. The material emphasizes recognizing the reality of the spiritual struggle and equipping ourselves accordingly. Using the imagery of the armor of God from Ephesians, where prayer is presented as both a defensive shield and an offensive weapon.
And the sources dig into the different roles prayer plays here, the authority in intercession to bind negative influences and loose God's blessings.
Right, aligning with his will.
The power to break down those ingrained beliefs, those strongholds that hinder the gospel. And the way prayer sharpens our spiritual discernment, helping us recognize and counter opposing tactics. That theological understanding of binding and loosing really refers to operating in alignment with God's authority to resist evil and advance his kingdom.
So practically, how do we integrate that understanding into our daily efforts to share faith?
Well, the sources suggest being intentional at every step, engaging in prayer before any interaction, maintaining a prayerful attitude during conversations, continuing in prayer afterwards for lasting impact, and crucially, the church coming together in corporate prayer as a unified spiritual force.
The material then wraps up with this really powerful image, the idea of building the unseen engine, a specifically Christian and biblical view that positions prayer as the real, often invisible power source driving all evangelization.
It definitely reframes prayer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Moving it from maybe a background activity to the absolute core mechanism fueling everything else.
Yes, and the material points to the biblical precedent. The early church praying fervently before Pentecost, Paul constantly asking for prayer to support his mission journeys. It paints this picture of a church that deeply integrates prayer into its mission, where prayer isn't just an event, it's part of its DNA.
And the practical side of that involves both personal commitment, each of us living as missional intercessors, maybe creating personal prayer plans, using tools like maps to pray for unreached areas, even focused fasting, and then communally equipping the local church to be this unseen engine through dedicated mission prayer teams, regular mission prayer nights, adopting missionaries or regions to pray for, ensuring mission-focused prayer is just a normal part of church services.
And it powerfully connects prayer back to spiritual warfare, that through prayer we engage in binding negative influences, tearing down strongholds of unbelief, and asking God to open people's spiritual eyes to the truth. These are all seen as key functions of this unseen engine.
Ultimately, the sources make a really compelling case for why prayer has to come first. It aligns our hearts with God's, it awakens compassion, it releases spiritual authority, and it empowers the laborers out in the field.
So just to sum up then, you've brought together a really rich collection of insights here, all pointing to the profound role of prayer in evangelization, how it acts as the foundation, the driving force, and that crucial unseen engine powering the mission. We've touched on its deep biblical roots, its consistent historical impact, and a whole host of practical ways to integrate it more fully into our lives and strategies.
And this isn't just, abstract theology, is it? For you listening, as someone committed to making a meaningful impact in your world, this deep dive offers, I think, practical wisdom, a fresh perspective perhaps, on how intentionally engaging in prayer could provide a transformative edge in whatever you're doing.
So maybe as you go about your day, just consider this. How might your own consistent, fervent prayer be the key? The key to unlocking unforeseen breakthroughs, not just in sharing faith, but maybe in every area of your life and work. How might your prayers, individually and collectively, be shaping the spiritual landscape in ways you haven't even realized yet? It's certainly a profound area for ongoing thought and, well, action.